Alright, so there's a speaker called the BBC LS59. Today, if you were to get a properly licensed version of this speaker, it would cost $6,000 to $7,000. But this one costs $949, and that's including shipping. And after having lived with the speaker for the last few months, I began to ask an uncomfortable question. How much of that $6,000 is the speaker, the actual speaker, and how much of it is the branding? Because honestly, this thing sounds a lot better than it probably should. And by the end of this video, you might start questioning a few things about how speakers are priced in this industry. Now, the company behind this speaker is Sound Artist. And if you've been around the audiophile world long enough, then you might be actually familiar with that name. They are a Chinese manufacturer that's been quietly building speakers inspired mainly by classic British monitor designs. What's really interesting about this company is that instead of trying to reinvent everything, they are known for taking proven loudspeaker concepts and making it accessible for the wider audience. And the LS59 is probably their most ambitious attempt yet. Because recreating a BBC-style monitor isn't just about copying the cabinet shape and size, it's about the tuning, the mid-range balance, and how the crossover integrates the drivers. That's where the character of these speakers truly come from. So the real question here is, did Sound Artist make a speaker that looks like the LS59, or did they manage to capture the actual sound philosophy behind it? So let's talk about how it sounds. When I first listened to these speakers, the first thing that struck me was how relaxed it sounded. Not flashy, not exaggerated, just natural. If you're coming from a modern day speaker that emphasizes high frequency extension, detail, and sparkle, then the high frequency on the Sound Artist may feel a little bit understated. However, give it a few minutes for your ears to adjust and the vocals become incredibly believable. Acoustic instruments have real weight. Nothing feels artificially boosted, and that's when it clicked for me. This isn't a speaker that impresses you in the first 5 seconds of listening. No. This is a speaker that the longer you listen, the more impressed you become and the more you appreciate. Which is exactly what the LS59 design has always been known for. Vocals just sound right. Male vocals, female vocals, jazz recordings, acoustic guitar. There's a natural tonality to them that makes everything feel believable. And when a speaker does mid-range this well, you notice that immediately. Now, the other thing that surprised me was the dynamics. These actually hit harder than I expected. Now, do they extend as low as the Arendal 1610 series? No. That speaker is simply playing in a whole different league when it comes to deep bass extension. But what the Sound Artist does really well is mid-bass punch. The bass here has a very rounded, full-bodied character. It may not be the fastest bass you've ever heard or the cleanest, but it has weight. And you really notice it on certain tracks. For example, Kissin' Blue by Yellow. When that bass line kicks in, you get this really satisfying sense of body. It doesn't sound thin, it doesn't sound lightweight, it sounds big and rich. And honestly, this might be the part that surprises some people, because once you hear the mid-range and the mid-bass on this speaker, you start to question how many $5,000 speakers today is actually better than this, and how many are just simply more expensive. Now, there were a couple interesting things I discovered while living with these speakers. First, leave the grills on. Normally when I review speakers, I immediately take the grills off, but on this speaker, it actually sounds more correct with the grills installed. When I took them off, I began to notice some edge diffraction happening from the cabinet. Put the grills back on and everything's smooth again. So this is one of those rare speakers that the grill is part of the acoustic design. Second small thing, the little logo badge on the front. I personally noticed that if you play music really loud with some bass heavy music, you begin to hear that flapping of that logo. Not a big deal though, it's basically just a sticker badge, so if it bothers you, you can literally peel it off. Problem solved? Easy. Now let's talk about treble. Now the tweeter is not meant to jump out at you. It's not overly forward, it's not overly energetic. In fact, it's smooth and it's relaxed. which again fits perfectly with the whole BBC monitor philosophy. The goal here isn't to impress you with sparkle, the goal here is to avoid listening fatigue. Even after long listening sessions, the treble never becomes offensive, it stays perfectly smooth, even at cranking loud volumes. Imaging in sound staging is also very nice. While it doesn't throw a humongous soundstage, it actually throws a larger soundstage than most bookshelf speakers are capable of. And what's interesting is that it actually locks into place very easily so that you can actually hear into the mix very well separated instrumentals, vocals, in almost all the tracks including classical. And it's actually suitable for a wide variety of music because of the tuning here. But there are a few practical things that I noticed that might become useful when you set up this speaker in your room. First, the stand height matters more than you might expect. I'm personally using a 24-inch solid steel stand here to match the acoustic center to my ears. But the mistake that a lot of people make here is assuming that the tweeter is on the top portion of the cabinet because the grill is covering it, they don't really see the tweeter, and therefore put the speakers on a stand that is much lower than it should be. The tweeter and the acoustic center is actually much closer to the center of the cabinet on the speaker, so it's important to get the right height stand so that the acoustic center is aligned with your ears. And when the height of the stand is proper, everything just locks in properly. The mid-range snaps into focus, and the imaging becomes more coherent. And the second thing that may be a surprise to a lot of people is that this speaker is actually not that hard to drive. It's actually pretty easy to drive. For example, I tried them with the Wilsonton R200, which is a really nice budget tube amp option. And that pairing already sounded very good. But where the things got really interesting for me was with the Cayenne Jazz 80. That combination, I think, had some synergy going on. It had better control, it had better refinement overall, and overall, it complemented the sound of the sound artist, that relaxed, smooth sound, very, very well. I also experimented with some low-powered high-end tube amps from Bunoco, both the 6L6P amplifier and the 300B amplifier, which honestly surprised me because both were able to draw the sound artist no problem. Now technically the 300B is the lower powered amp of the two, but interestingly that's the one that I preferred. The vocals had more sense of realism to it, and it's something about that 300B mid-range married to the speaker that just brings the musicality and the enjoyment to a whole different level. And once I got to that level, I started messing around with the PEQ on the Eversolo a little bit. With a few small adjustments, I was actually able to shape the response slightly to bring it even closer to the original LS59 tonal balance. Nothing dramatic, just small tunings, because when I measured the sound artist, it was already very close to the original LS59's response, so small tweaks was all that was required. And I'll link to the PEQ profile that I used in the description below. Because while I'm using the T8, the PEQ function should be in almost every Eversolo unit. And that's the thing about modern digital systems. You can take a speaker that already sounds very good and make small, careful adjustments to even dial it in further to make it better. Now, we get to the big question. How do these compare to the $6,000 LS59 speakers? Well, the actual licensed versions are still more refined. Better cabinetry, with more sophisticated drivers, the craftsmanship that goes into it, their heritage, more polished overall. But here's the surprising part. The sound artist captures a lot of the same fundamental character. The tonal balance, the vocal realism, the relaxed presentation, and it does that for 1/6 of the price. And honestly, what surprised me wasn't that this speaker sounds good for $949. It was that it sounded like it belonged in a whole different price conversation. Maybe great sound and hi-fi doesn't always have to cost $6,000. And this is the part that might actually annoy some people that are in the audiophile world, because if a $949 speaker can get this close to a $6,000 speaker, then it begins to raise some uncomfortable questions. So who are these speakers really for? If you love vocals, jazz music, acoustic music, even classical music, I think this speaker can be really rewarding because it doesn't really hide anything but also doesn't exaggerate anything when it comes to these recordings. It simply lets you hear it in the most natural way possible. At the end of the day, the sound artist LS59 isn't trying to reinvent hi-fi. It's bringing that classical BBC studio monitor sound at a price point that wasn't accessible before. And for $949, that alone makes it one of the most fascinating speakers I've heard recently. Because sometimes great ideas in audio don't just disappear, they quietly find its way back.